Okay, hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Welcome to this Middle East Council webinar on Iran's elections and its domestic and regional implications. My name is Hamid Reza Azizi, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. As we all know, following the death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash on May 19, there was a snap election in Iran to elect a new president. Contrary to the expectations of many observers, myself included, and as Iran never stopped surprising the world, actually, the election has brought to power a reformist figure, first time in almost 2 decades. Masoud Pezeshkian, a heart surgeon, a former health minister, and a longtime representative of Tabriz in the Iranian parliament, is now the president of Iran. But what will be the implications of Pezeshkian's presidency for Iran's domestic politics and foreign relations? Today, we are joined by 3 distinguished experts to discuss this topic. Dr. Azadeh Zamiri-Rad, Deputy Head of Africa and Middle East at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Dr. Mahjoub Zoveiri, Professor in Contemporary Middle East Politics at Qatar University, and Dr. Rasool Sardar Atash, Senior International Correspondent, Al Jazeera English. Welcome to you. Each speaker will provide introductory remarks for maximum 10 minutes so that we will hopefully have enough time for Q&A. Let's start with you, Dr. Atash. You were in Iran recently covering the election for Al Jazeera. Therefore, I believe you have a first-hand experience of the latest developments that many of us don't. Could you share with us and the audience actually your insights of the electoral mood in Iran, especially among the public, and also your analysis on the main factors that led to Pezeshkian's victory? And if you can also share your views on whether you think Pezeshkian can help repair the Islamic Republic's legitimacy crisis, that would be also great. Over to you.
Thank you, Hamid. I was in Iran and covering this whole process for roughly over 70 days. And I was there when the helicopter crashed. Simply, when we talk about the public mood regarding the elections, so we can see that's just a phenomenon that the voter apathy has increased tremendously, particularly in the recent years. So that trend actually has started by the second term of Hassan Rouhani, but it just reached a peak in 2021 presidential election. So the overall turnout was below 49%. And that was a record low turnout. So then in March 2024, parliamentary elections, that turnout went below 41%. That was another new record. So, and then that, of course, has created a tremendous concerns and the pressing panic among the Iranian political establishment. Then when the snap elections were announced to be held on May 28th, June 28th, there was a tremendous effort from the Iranian political establishment, officials, authorities, calling on people again and again to attend the voting process, this democratic process. And so despite all of that attempts, the overall turnout in the first round went below 40%. That was another record. So we are just talking about the downward trend of the turnout in the elections in Iran in its recent history. So the reason that this turnout is being regarded as a legitimacy problem, because traditionally in Iran, the political establishment has enjoyed high turnouts. And whenever it was facing questions regarding its legitimacy, the Iranian officials were proudly saying, well, look at the election turnout in our country. Very few democracies in the West enjoying that high turnouts. So the turnouts have been the primary source of the legitimacy for the political establishment, for the system, for the political elites over there. And then when that has changed, it naturally caused a panic. And even we have seen in the first round of the presidential election, recent presidential election, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, after casting his ballot, has said that he called on people to attend the voting and come into the polling stations, and it directly associated the high turnout with the continuity and the dignity of the Islamic establishment. So I think that was quite a dangerous attempt, and it failed. So once you call on people to attend by large numbers and associating their attendance with the dignity and continuity of the system, then when people do not appear at the ballot boxes, what does that mean? So when I was asking people whether they're going to vote or not, or which candidate they are going to support, mostly they will say, well, I'm not going to the ballot boxes. However, if I go, I will vote for Pezeshkian. That was the mood, and it reflected in the first round. In the second round as well, despite the turnout slightly going up by 10%, but still below 50%, we should note that more than half of Iranians didn't go to the ballot boxes. And the reason for that, first, the economic hardships, the international sanctions, but mainly the disbelief in the system, the discontent with the governments, how they performed. So very few people really are having hope and faith in elections that they will bring any change, whether conservative or reformist, regardless of the candidates that are going to run the country. They have very little faith in the elections that could bring the change. That's why the voter apathy is increasing. So the main factors that led Pezeshkian's victory, I think there were three front runners. So Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, the current parliament speaker, Said Jalili, the conservative candidate, the hardline conservative candidate, and Masoud Pezeshkian. So regarding Kalibaf, there has been lots of fraud allegations recently, and I think that has been particularly spearheaded by the media outlets that were associated with the hardline conservatives, even with Jalili himself. And I think that has tarnished his reputation. And despite coming third, we can see that even among the conservative voter bases, he has lost his legitimacy to a certain extent. He received roughly around 14%, but that was not enough to make him to run for the second round. And that has helped to Pezeshkian in the first round, because the conservatives were divided between Jalili and Pezeshkian. Between Jalili and Kalibaf. Then in the second round, I think the main factor was the fear factor. People were quite concerned. Iranians were quite concerned that if Jalili form a government, that government is going to be probably the most hardline government in the history of the Islamic Republic. And Jalili himself was not promising change. He was simply saying that he's going to be committed to the policies of the late President Ibrahim Raisi. But people were well aware of that Jalili is even more conservative than Raisi himself. So this fear factor has been played by the reformists as well. I will say through the presidential campaign of the reformists, I haven't heard anything new from them, but rather they also have played on that. Look, if you do not vote for us, then Jalili is going to come, and you see their policies. Their policies are quite hardline, are going to further isolate Iran from the world, further crack down on the opponents in the country, and so on. That fear factor has played a lot. So, and even in the second round, I think those who have voted in the first round for Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf even did not voted for Jalili as a united front, despite Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf saying that he's supporting Jalili, but it was just one-time statement. And even his campaign managers in different cities, they said, well, they're going to support the reformist candidate, Masoud Pezeshkian. So another factor that I think played a role and that has not been mentioned properly. For the first time, I have covered couple of elections in Iran. For the first time, I have seen that these ethnic lines are playing a role. And Masoud Pezeshkian was capitalizing on his Azeri identity as well. That's why the turnout, particularly in the Turkish majority countries at the north of in the Turkish majority regions at the north of the country, the turnout was higher than the national one, the national turnout. Masoud Pezeshkian has been emphasizing his Turkish identity as well, and that has appealed to the Azeri voters. And even that has been an issue that in the second round, so there has been lots of speculations about the fathers, about the mothers, whether Jalali's father is a Kurd or his mother is Turk, and Pezeshkian's father being Turk, his mother being Kurd, correct or not, factually confirmed or not. But that has been also another part of the discussion through that presidential campaign, particularly during the second round. So can Pezeshkian help to repair the Islamic Republic legitimacy? I think when we talk about the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, so we're simply talking about the legitimacy at home and legitimacy abroad. Abroad, I don't think that Iran is having a legitimacy crisis. So starting from the Gulf, across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, and to a certain extent over Africa, North Africa, imagine like Sheikh Zakzaki, for example. There's still, Iran is enjoying that legitimacy of the so-called resistance, the resistance movements or the resistance groups. And so, but Iran's main challenge is at home. More and more people are growing apathy toward the elections. More and more people are becoming desperate. So, and that is creating an internal fragility. I think Iranian society is quite fragile and quite deeply divided across the political lines. So Pezeshkian's election, Pezeshkian being elected as the president of the country for a short while, I think will observe that energy that is accumulated, that anti-establishment energy that is accumulated. However, for the long run, I have little hope in Pezeshkian that he will really make a real change and be a bridge between people and the state. And the reason for that, because Pezeshkian has promised a lot throughout his presidential campaign. But now it is time to deliver on his promises. And when it comes to delivering on his promises, there are tremendous challenges. So the first challenge is going to be internal, coming from the political establishment. Almost for sure that he is going to face challenge from the political elites, from the powerful unelected officials, the political bodies, the councils, the shuras, the majlis, lots of that, all of that hierarchy, all of that political structure of Iran. He's going to face tremendous resistance from that, and probably is going to be undermined quite quickly. So he's well aware of that. On the other hand, now he has to work with a parliament that is very much conservative dominated. His chance probably is having Kalibaf as the parliament speaker, because Kalibaf is a pragmatist. He's regarded as a moderate conservative, but also there is a huge division and rift between Kalibaf and the teams of late President Raisi and those who are affiliated with Jalali as well. So maybe Pezeshkian could a little bit benefit from that rift. However, at the end of the day, the parliament that the president has to work with is already conservative dominated parliament. So the international factor is that to deliver on his promises, he has to leave the sanctions. And the sanctions is not only about Iran. So he has to convince the West first that Tehran is ready for the talks, for renegotiating a nuclear deal, but also convince the West to re-engage into the negotiations as well. I think one thing that is unjust when we talk about the conservatives, we think that the conservatives are against the negotiations while the reformists are always in favor of the negotiations. That is not true. Conservative governments also have been in constant engagement and negotiation with the Western powers. So here, while we're debating and disputing Iran's intents and Iran's genuinity regarding the negotiations, I think the same is valid for the Western countries as well. So we'll see if the Western countries are really going to show a genuine commitment to re-engage, to renegotiate a nuclear deal with Iran or not, whether Mr. Pezeshkian is going to be able to, first, on one hand, convince the West that Tehran is ready for the negotiations, convinced the West that they also need to show a serious commitment to the negotiations, while ensuring the political elites in Iran that his policies are not going to disrupt the system. And that is a very much delicate balance. It's almost impossible to manage this process. So I think Pezeshkian's government is not going to be the third term of Mohammad Khatami, the first reformist president of Iran, but rather I would agree with the assessment that his government is going to be more or less like a third government or the third term of Hassan Rouhani. First, because Pezeshkian was not regarded as one of the prominent reformist figures in the country. He doesn't have a strong team across the bureaucracy that is ready to work with him. He has to form a team, a governing team from the previous government and from the circles around the reformists. So he's going to have a tough time really to be Masoud Pezeshkian himself, but rather I think he's going to be greatly influenced by the teams that have remained from the previous government of Hassan Rouhani. Because Masoud Pezeshkian, despite we calling him a reformist, he's not a typical reformist. Throughout the presidential campaign, throughout the presidential debates, there has been 7 of them, 5 before the first round of the election and 2 between the first and the second round, throughout his presidential debates as well. Again and again, repeatedly, he has emphasized that he's committed to the revolutionary principles. He's going to follow the guidelines that are set by the supreme leader, and he has no problem by the core issue with the core principles of the revolution and so on. And of course, many people are saying that these repeated messages were an attempt trying to avoid a rift between himself and the political establishment. However, that was creating another complication, because those who were voting for him, particularly the reformist segments of the society, were also expecting him really to talk about some solid politics and come up with some solid criticisms as well toward the accumulated problems, but he has avoided that. So that's why, and even through the presidential debates, he was frequently referring to the original, the old text, the religious text, and trying to secure the system that he's not a threat for the political elites, for the political establishment, and also for the Islamic system over there. So, as I said, that has caused quite a discontent among his supporters. That criticism was over there, but the fear factor about the Jalili still caused them to ignore this fact. So I will not call Pezeshkian as a reformist politician, but rather I would call him as a moderate conservative.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very comprehensive overview. That was indeed really helpful. And we will certainly get back to you with some questions in the Q&A. And I would like to ask the audience if they have any question, they can write it in there's this Q&A box in the Zoom functions. You can use that, send your questions, and then we will try to ask the speakers to address them. So thank you again, and let's turn to Dr. Zamiralot. Maybe you could share your analysis on the implications of Pezeshkian's victory for Iran's domestic and foreign policy. Rasul mentioned some aspects, but I guess we can start from where he ended actually, whether we can call Pezeshkian a reformist, whether we should expect actual reform, or to what extent we can expect changes actually in Iran's domestic and foreign policy. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes. So in a way, reformists are back. So what can we expect? Can they bring about change, particularly in the social realm? And I think before I can tackle that question, we need to have a brief moment to look back at history and look at previous reformist presidents. I mean, it's been around 3 decades nearly since we saw the first reformist president, Khatami. And it's been nearly a decade now since we've seen a pragmatic conservative who entered an alliance with reformists taking over office, which was Hassan Rouhani, and whose term and who was in place until only a couple of years ago. So even if you consider him a pragmatic conservative or more pragmatic than reformist, if you look at these two examples in the past, we have to say that those records were quite poor when it comes to actual substantial social change. So going back to Khatami, I mean, bear in mind that back then Khatami's victory was accompanied by huge expectations in the broader population and an actual sense of hope regarding reforms. I mean, the Second Hordad movement came in with raising these kind of expectations, saying that they would try change from within, who wanted to strengthen personal freedom, strengthen minority rights when it comes to ethnic or religious minorities, women's rights, who wanted a clear establishment of the rule of law, who wanted accountability, all of these things that in the end never really materialized. And if you look at the Rouhani government, within 8 years, pragmatic conservatives and reformists weren't even able to get the house arrest lifted of leading figures of the 2009 Green Movement. So if you take these things together and look at some of the legislative projects that they try to push, again, you will see that the outcome at least has been subpar, to say the least. Look at the twin bills proposals, the major points of the Khatami government, where he tried to extend the authority of the presidency, the one elected kind of body here, and try to limit the authority of the Guardian Council, particularly with regard to the electoral process. Again, both legislative projects were blocked. So again, here, he couldn't really deliver on his promises. At the same time, what we saw was a continuation of repression, a continuation of execution, a continuation of torture, a continuation of the limitation of the freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. We had a brutal crackdown of student protests under the Khatami government. We had a record high number of executions under the Rouhani government. So if we look at these kind of figures overall from a general social perspective, not much has materialized under either a reformist government or a moderate conservative, pragmatic conservative government here. Now, that is not to say that nothing happened and that there hadn't been any kind of changes. In fact, if we look back to the reformist era, there have been some impacts. I mean, we had a very proactive civil society, at least compared to eras where hardline conservatives were in charge. We also saw the establishment of electoral councils in villages and cities, so kind of a power decentralization project that we saw under the reformists taking place. So these were minor kind of steps forward, but from a general point of view of a general public, and this has been reflected in the turnout of these past years, this has simply not been enough. This has not been enough to convince people that reformism works and that reforms can actually be established within the framework of the current system. So the overall question that we need to ask ourselves, and in the end ask Pezeshkian for that matter, is why he actually thinks that he can succeed where everyone before him failed. And I think he doesn't really have an answer for that. And this is a kind of significant fundamental doubt in the general population that we have seen reflected in voter turnout. It has been just also mentioned in a previous presentation that turnout has continuously dropped. And bear in mind that when Khatami came into office, turnout, according to official figures, were as high as 80%, and he had 70% of the votes in the first round of elections. So he had pretty, large public backing. Compare that to Pezeshkian this time, where the turnout of below 40% for the first round, and a turnout of below 50% in the second round, despite the fact that the alternative to Pezeshkian would have been one of the most hardline, radical, ultra-radical figures imaginable on this position. And still, it didn't push a large number of the electorate to come and cast a ballot. And I think this is significant, and it's very much reflective of the mood that and the general sentiment that we've seen in the general population, which has also been reflected in slogans and mass protests of these past years, that as of this point, a large number of the electorate doesn't make a significant distinction between so-called reformists and so-called hardliners anymore. They simply did not see Jalili as much of a nightmare as compared to Pezeshkian, simply because they don't think Pezeshkian can deliver anything of substance. And I think this is a very important thing to note, Pezeshkian did not come into office on a wave of popular support. So we shouldn't misconstrue his victory here as a kind of new wave of hope, a kind of new kind of revival of reformists, because I don't think this is reflected in the actual election results. So he doesn't have broad popular backing, but on top of that, he doesn't really have broad state backing either. He doesn't have the kind of connections into the deep state, and he will be opposed, and we've already heard that in the first presentation, by hardline forces that have been dominating nearly all other, or I might say all other elected and non-elected power centers in the Islamic Republic. He will be heavily opposed by hardliners who are dominating the parliament since 2020, and not just hardliners. This is the Stability Front, the ultra-radical front, the most critical front that you can imagine when it comes to nuclear negotiations, the most critical front that you can imagine when it comes to social and political liberalization. These are the people that he has to face. So no general public backing, no deep state backing, no state apparatus backing, and add to that we are currently in Iran in a very critical transitional stage. This is not any given time in the history of the Islamic Republic. The supreme leader has been very precisely and very thoroughly preparing for his succession. He's preparing for transition, and he wants an orderly transition. And he has actually further shrunk the spaces politically and socially in these past years, particularly since 2019. And we've seen an increase in repression and an increase in kind of further shrinking spaces since the Women Life Freedom Movement and the mass protests that we saw there. So no inclination and no indication for any kind of social liberalization, no concessions made. On the contrary, we've seen tighter legislation on the dress code. We've seen tighter implementation and enforcement of the dress code. We've seen more repression and brutality from what we hear out of prisons. So this is the kind of space that the person like Pezeshkian is entering into, a critical transitional space with very little backing from different kind of important parts of society and state. Now, does that all mean that it doesn't make any difference if Pezeshkian is in place? Could it have just as well been Jalili? Doesn't the president have any kind of impact? No, I do believe there are some impacts that can be made, and I want to name 3 of them. 3 areas where I think that the election can have an impact potentially and do matter in the end, even though I don't believe that he will be the game changer when it comes to any kind of socio-political kind of reforms, for all the reasons that I just stated. But 3 areas where I think an impact could be felt. One of them on the foreign policy front, and we can talk a little bit more about foreign policy later, but I know there will be another presentation, so I don't want to go too much into detail here. But one area is certainly the nuclear file. And I think that has particularly to do with the institutional setup and the role that the president plays in nuclear decision shaping within the Islamic Republic. I think a large part of nuclear policy at this point is set and has been set by the previous government. But there are some areas where I believe Pezeshkian, though not being a game changer, can have some impact. And this is particularly with regard to the question of whether Iran will actually want to cross the nuclear threshold or not. Here, I think Pezeshkian can play an important role in Iran not crossing their threshold, and where nuclear negotiations are possible, just as they have been possible under Raisi, which has also already been mentioned. It's not a reformist-only thing to enter negotiations. So the nuclear file is one area where potential impact is possible. Another area maybe is a little bit more theoretical, but if we think about the transitional phase as a highly critical phase for all autocratic systems, because this is the phase where the actual office of power is at stake, it's not the presidency, but the supreme leadership. And if we move forward with more mass protests, and Iran is in a space now where protests can erupt at any given time, almost everywhere in the country, and evolve into something much, much bigger and have far more dynamics, then I think we could envision certain scenarios in which the supreme leader might seriously consider opening and reopening up some of the space. And this is the kind of tendency that we've seen with a lot of autocratic systems when put under pressure, where they have to make this difficult choice of whether or not to open the system in order to preserve it, or whether to back down and repress further. So far, we've seen further repression, but it's not a given. And with further mass protests and pressure from the society, I think the debate of, do we need to open up a little bit to preserve ourselves, to preserve the Islamic Republic, will once again take shape. And here, I think Pezeshkian is more of a political outlet for Khamenei than Jalili would have been. Would be easier for Khamenei to open up certain spaces under a reformist president than it would have been under a hardliner. And a last point area where I think impact can be quite significant, maybe the most important one, is when it comes to power struggles. We've seen a very clear strategy by Khamenei since 2019, since he announced the so-called second step of the revolution, of homogenizing the domestic sphere, of shrinking the space, not only for society, but actually also for the political elites, in order to kind of avoid heightened power struggles in times of actual transition and to avoid public unrest by putting more repression into place. So these were kind of the two pillars of this transitional kind of strategy. Now with reformists coming back in, and with them also certain new openings for pragmatic conservatives who have been sidelined by Khamenei in these past years, you have far more dynamics in power relations, you have far more likelihood of increased tensions and increased actual rifts that could come up. And I think rifts are the one area where parts of Iranian society who view themselves as part of a new protest movement could actually benefit from. So overall, I think rather than thinking about concrete reforms in terms of socio-political kind of output Pezeshkian could put forward, I think it's more helpful to discuss the overall impact that this kind of election could have on power dynamics, on power sharing in Iran, and on the overall social political dynamics on the ground, rather than specific kind of reforms where I don't see much happening anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. I'm sure there's quite a few questions. And I encourage the audience once again to raise their questions using the Q&A box in the Zoom. So last but not least, Dr. Zoveiri. I think a key question, especially given your long-time expertise on Iran's relations with its Arab neighbors and the Arab world in general, is that whether Pezeshkian's presidency can result in any change, whether positive or negative, actually, in Iran's relations with Arab neighbors and its regional policy more broadly speaking. So especially taking into consideration the recent trends, improving relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, others. And also, it would be great if you could tell us how the election and its results could actually are perceived in the Arab world. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. This is the ninth president we talk about. I have witnessed 7 elections since 1997. And since we talk about the ninth president, my contribution will be shared with you in 9 quick messages. The first message actually is in the previous talk we have with Rasul, Dr. Adil Abdel Ghaffar asked me about my prediction about the result. And my answer was, if he is with us, Adil, remember that I said the election is not about individuals, about the establishment. So I'm still with this opinion that the elections in Iran and the Islamic Republic is about the establishment, is about the image of the regime. And the regime, since day one, insisted on the image, and having the election is an important matter, important message to be conveyed to the world. And this has a long history. This has to go back to Mashrutiyat, Constitutional Revolution 1906, and then what happened in 1950s, and then Khomeini. And so that is, it has what I call it the epistemology of the elections in Iranian politics. It has a very huge I would say knowledge and understanding within to understand why the elections is important in the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and why they make it a big issue every time, and they cover it in a way that's as the only country has elections. So it's about the image. Number 2, I don't believe that we have any more reformist campaign in Iran since 2005. What we have is the remaining voices. And I think I would remind the audience of what Karoubi said after the sacking of 90 ambassadors when Ahmadinejad came to power. He said, مع Ambassador Darim بري job نادرا يعني وإن he wants to say that we have many ambassadors jobless basically because they were sacked by Ahmadinejad. And that was a message that the reformists were basically were wiped out of the Iranian political scene. Ahmadinejad has done a lot. Hassan Rouhani has failed to bring them back, with the exception of some voices, and they have to change actually their narrative. And then, of course, Raisi has little to play. So we talk about some voices, they try to bring sort of change of Iran. And I think, again, the establishment is actually, is helping in doing so. That shows a diversity within of voices within Iranian politics that also serves the establishment. The third message is whenever we talk about reformists in particular, or sorry, what's remaining of reformists and the previous reformists, we talk about in national Iran. We talk about the strong feeling of being Iranian, and that is the talk. That is the important point when we talk about Pezeshkian and how he won with a majority of with high turn from the Turkish voters. The voice, the being Iranian is very strong, and that will have implication on foreign policy. If you go back to the foreign policy of Mahmoud Khatami, it was strong that he's behaving with the Arab neighboring country based of Iranian being Irani Budan, rather than an Iranian Islamic Budan. And even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has learned the lesson when he came to power. He used that we have an Iranian Islamic interpretation that is us, we presented to other Muslims. So Irani Budan and Iranian nationalists, that expected to be very bold when it comes to the foreign policy, especially with the neighboring countries. The fourth message, this president, Pezeshkian, every success may happen will rely on the way how he formed his government. If he opened the government to have more voices from what's remaining of reformist voices, conservative, and he was able to convince the parliament. Let's not forget, this guy has some personal impact. First of all, this guy he lost his wife. He maintained most of his time to help their kids after their mother. This has impact on the Iranian Iranian family. This guy he is religiously by nature. He is by nature, he's close to the religious circle. The way how his name was approved, as he said that with the supreme leader support. So he has some individual characters that will help him, what I call small politics, will help him to navigate his way on governance. And I think he will not be delivering, presenting one voice. He will try to be multi-voice president so he can gain more support from different, I would say, center of power. The message number 5, the parliament, the main obstacle is the parliament. But let's not forget that he's very close to the president, to the speaker, but also he's very close to most of the members, and that itself would help him at least in the first presidency, considering the fact that he's coming after the death of the previous president. The message number 6, he was trying to talk with a Khatami flavor. That was in the campaigning time, and that was very smart from him, because he wants to support those who have doubts about things to come and vote. Now they vote. Whether he will continue on that, I'm not sure. Let's not forget, he's a technocrat like Khatami. Khatami came when he was Minister of Culture with Rafsanjani, he became president. Now he's coming to become the 9th president when he used to be a Minister of Health. So basically he's a technocrat. But the ability, whether he has the ability, intellectual ability, to talk like Khatami, to speak about Khatami, to talk about, to throw ideas like Guftagoo of civilization, that was approved in 2001 from United Nations. All of these questions remain on the table, that whether he has this ability to come and talk about domestic politics issue and international issues with this kind of awareness, with this kind of deep knowledge, and this kind of knowledge about what's happening in the world. Khatami used to talk about philosophy of the German philosophy, the philosophy of the Islamic philosophy, bringing all of this together. Whether this guy has this talent, that's something to be looked at. The seventh message, when it comes to his foreign policy, I'm sure you heard about the article he published in Arab Al-Jadid yesterday. What I found this is the view of the establishment. This is the view of the Iranian establishment. Arab world to the establishment has not been seen differently. I mean, even under Hassan Rouhani, he tried to distance himself from Arab world, believing that he with the relation with the West he can solve a lot of problems, but that this kind of view will remain. Pezeshkian does not have the history and the ability to present a new discourse about the relation with the neighbor. He will be reflecting the establishment of the view, the view of the establishment. The establishment now wants a good ties with Saudi Arabia, for sure. They want to have zero problems with Turkey. They want to have zero problems even with a lot of issues. They distance themselves smartly of Gaza war, but they maintain the support of the resistance because they are worried about the ramification of showing a very strong support to what's happened in 7th of October. So when it comes to his regional foreign policy, I would expect to be more conservative, very driven by national interest of Iran rather than with Islamic interest of Iran. Of course, he had a very interesting communication with Ismail Haniyeh, but let's not forget, these are things designed by the establishment. All of this communication, all of this, because he's surrounded by those people who's connected to the establishment as well. So we cannot imagine that he will behave as he has nothing around him. And let's not forget, this is a person who's a man state. He was within the establishment for years. The message number 8, quickly, I don't think so there will be any serious change in his nuclear foreign policy, considering the fact that the West and the United States still are busy with a lot of issues important than the nuclear issue. And they link between having a concession to Iran on nuclear issue with what Iran is doing in the region according to the European and American foreign policy. So the nuclear issue will be on the table. They will continue to pressure him through the nuclear atomic energy, and I expect the next report will be a sort of harsh. There will be criticism, so to test the president, how he will behave toward all of that. And the 9th message, as we talk about the 9th president, I think Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is celebrating the moment of the elections, the election of having a dynamic for 50 days. You even with having 40%, which we all of us we know that with the real decline of the participation in the election, even with it having this dialogue going to 50%, that itself, to have 29% going to the vote, that to the establishment is a success. They may not talk about it in public, they may not reveal it, but within their circle, absolutely they see it as an achievement. Of course, if there's percentage more, it will be better. But even with this percentage, to us as an expert, as an academic, we analyze this. Still, it's an achievement for them, and it still means that there is a strong base to the regime, to the establishment, considering all of these facts. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting categorization of the messages of this election and the presidency of Masoud Pezeshkian. So We have enough time, I think, to have a round of, or 2 rounds at least of Q&A. So let's go on the same order. We received some questions actually before the start of the meeting through email, and we also have some questions here. I try to somehow integrate the most relevant ones and address to the speakers. So let's start with you, Rasul, once again. Actually, one of the interesting things you mentioned, and this is one of the topics that also inside Iran is hotly debated among some experts, you know, kind of observers of electoral campaigns, is about whether or to what extent the votes that Pezeshkian received was, I mean, had to do with his ethnic background. So we know that, as you mentioned also, the support in Iran's Azerbaijan province in Tabriz was more, but you know, some people might wonder whether it was an actual ethnic vote or simply because he was best known in the area. So I think this is a very important question, and if you can share your insights on that, would be great.
Well, Hamid, I think both. So, so he has been serving in the parliament as an MP from the region of Tabriz, from the city of Tabriz, which is the largest Turkish majority city in Iran. And it was not only in Tabriz, in Erdebil, in East Azerbaijan, West Azerbaijan, and lots of Turkish majority cities and regions, particularly at the north and the northwest of the country. So yes, he's a well-known figure there, but also we should know that he got this tremendous support from the Kurdish majority areas as well. So that could be a matter of another discussion. However, as I said first, yes, he was well-known across the Turkish majority regions, but also I have been observing that over the time, particularly after the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Azeri identity is getting bolder and bolder. Somehow the discontent among the Azeris regarding many of the policies of the establishment or their alliances and so on. This Azeri identity is becoming bolder and it's becoming kind of more visible. I'm not saying that this is a rupture or a departure from the system. It's not at that level yet. However, we can see that more and more people are leaning toward their ethnicities, or let's say rediscovering their ethnic roots and so on. This is an interesting trend in Iran. We can see this trend among the Kurds, among the Baluchs, and now among Azeris much more. The reason that it has not been at like I would say one of the pressing issues so far for Iran, because overwhelming majority of the Azeris are also Shias, and still that religious identity traditionally, I mean, through the centuries, has been much more dominant than the ethnic identities. But recently, while the discontent toward the political establishment is growing, peoples are rediscovering some different identities as well. So these religious identities are losing their eminence, and the different identities are replacing that. So that's why I will say both. But here again, I think maybe that this should be clearly emphasized, that we're talking about the reformists and the conservatives. So just this is a way of simplifying issues to make it understandable. So actually in Iran, when we talk about the reformists and the conservatives, we are not talking about a complete crystal clear separations and two different camps. But rather, if I have to describe who are the reformists, who are being regarded as reformists and who are regarded as conservatives, I will say those who are coming from the security apparatuses, or those who have close relations with the security apparatuses in the political system, are being regarded as conservatives, while the politicians that are not directly coming from the security apparatuses or not have close ties with the security apparatuses, but still within the system, they are regarded as reformist. But one thing is clear: all of those politicians who are running for president or becoming president or holding important posts, across the country. At the end of the day, they need to be approved for this by the system, and they again emphasize their loyalty toward the system. So that also should be reemphasized. When we talk about reformists and conservatives, we are not talking typically about the Western terms of reformists and conservatives.
Thank you so much. You actually answered another question from the audience, which was about the distinction between reformists and conservatives. It was very helpful. Thank you. So, Azadeh, actually, there's a few questions on the foreign policy, and you also touched upon that when mentioning that who is president can actually have an impact on foreign policy, especially, for example, when it comes to the decision by Iran whether or not to cross the threshold. And so, in your view, what would be the overall impact on the foreign policy, especially when it comes to the relationship with the West and the nuclear agreement? Some people argue that we should basically keep our expectations low because Iran is already highly advanced in its uranium enrichment program, and the best we can expect would be actually some sort of an interim agreement. On the other hand, we have the US elections coming, and who is going to be president in the US will probably also have an impact on the extent to which an Iranian president, in this case Pezeshkian, can be successful. So if you can share your views on this, especially with an eye to the upcoming US election, that would be helpful. You are muted, Azadeh.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. First of all, yes, we are kind of in a waiting situation where not only in Tehran, but also in Europe and elsewhere, people are waiting for the US elections to see who will be in the White House in order to have some idea of where we can actually really pick up on negotiations and talks. We've already seen some back-channel talks happening on the Rai Sea. So this is not going to be, again, as I said, a game-changing moment to have Pezeshkian in place here. What is a bit different, though, is that Pezeshkian has asked for direct talks with the US very openly, and he wants further engagement with the West. So he is opposed to this kind of trend that we've been seeing in Tehran for the past years of having an entirely look to the East focused policy that relies too much on China, on Russia, on the Eastern Hemisphere and the global South, because he believes that in the end, Iran's major economic problems, where sanctions do play a significant role, even though they are not the cause of these problems, you have far more important, significant factors playing in, such as corruption, mismanagement, and unaccountable power centers. But sanctions do play in. So he's of the conviction that we need to lift sanctions, that we need to engage with the West, because this will otherwise hinder our economic progress. And first of all, most importantly, even hinder foreign direct investment coming to Iran. And this is what Iran essentially needs, foreign direct investment. It's already obstructing Iran's look to the East policy, meaning that even countries such as China do feel the pressure of US sanctions, even though up to this day, China is still the #1 actor helping Iran evade sanctions, particularly when it comes to Iranian oil exports. But again, even there are some certain constraints, given the fact that, of course, China doesn't do this for free. Iran has to give China significant discount when it comes to its oil exports. So Iran is kind of suffering economically from sanctions, even when they turn to the East. So this is a major kind of constraint. Also, by the way, with regard to economic relations with Arab Gulf states. I mean, we haven't seen since the normalization agreement huge waves of Arab direct investment in Iran. Of course not, because still there are a number of major economic issues in place that would hinder other states to invest in Iran and to further engage in economic transactions with Iran. Now, with regard to negotiations, nuclear negotiations overall, now the thing is, institutionally, the president has certain, let's say, advantages over other positions. So the cabinet has a majority in the Supreme National Security Council, for instance. That's by design. And the Supreme National Security Council is actually quite important when it comes to foreign policy decision-making in the nuclear realm. So you have people from the IRGC, from the regular army, we have representatives of the Supreme Leader, you have people from Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, different people coming together who are important for the nuclear decision shaping process. They give their recommendations with regard to nuclear policy. And here, having a majority can be helpful. And in the past, we've seen Iranian presidents have some significant impact on nuclear policy. We've seen it under Ahmadinejad, we've seen it under Rouhani. But again, as I said before, I don't believe that Pezeshkian can be a game changer here. He will continue some of the talks, the back channels that we've seen previously on the Raisi, and he might have some impact when it comes to the overall decision of actually crossing the threshold. We're at the stage now, so let me remind everyone, where Iran has almost mastered every single technological kind of obstacle here, almost all of them. At this point, it's no longer a technical question whether Iran will build nuclear bombs, it's a political decision. So when it's a political decision, it very much matters who sits at the table and who has a say. And not to overestimate the role of the president, but he has much more say in these kind of things than I would say in other foreign policy areas where I would say the role of the president is more limited, particularly when it comes to Iran's regional policy, for instance. So this is why I mentioned the nuclear file, because it is a bit of an exception here where the president can have a little bit more of a role. If I may, I wanted to pick up one other thing that came up several times here, because I think maybe we have different insights here, so we could have a bit of a discussion. So we've talked a lot about the so-called legitimacy crisis of the Islamic Republic due to low voter turnout. We talked about 40% of the electorate participating in the first round, 50% in the second round. Now, bear in mind, these are official figures. The actual figures could actually be far lower than these. We don't know. There's no real, independent oversight board that could verify that these are even the numbers. So we could be talking about far, far less kind of participation. And I doubt that this would be seen as a major kind of success. And on the contrary, I personally believe, and I think there's strong indication for it, that at this point, the Islamic Republic and the establishment doesn't care that much about legitimacy through the ballot box. And they clearly showed that in the 2021 elections that were very clearly designed to favor one candidate and one candidate only, where even the electoral kind of rules of the autocratic system, or the autocratic rules of the electoral system in the Islamic Republic, were essentially being completely abolished by the supreme leader. And we saw a degree of interference that we don't see every time around. So in other words, in 2021, we didn't have any real choice, not even between loyal participants of the system. Whereas this time around, at least it was open. Could have been Pezeshkian, could have been Jalili, maybe somebody else. So I think when we talk about legitimacy, we're at the point where the system is very much aware, the establishment, that they don't have the tools and they don't have the people, whether it be reformists or whoever comes in, who, claims to do something in terms of liberalization process and progress. They don't have the means and don't think that they have the means to claim a majority of support within Iranian society today. I think they are very aware of that, and they know how to compensate for this. And one way to compensate for this is, in fact, the foreign policy front. And here we see Iran, and it has been mentioned by other speakers here before, is actually on the rise and very comfortable when it comes to its position on the international stage. Iran is now a member of the BRICS Plus. Iran is now a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran feels emboldened and strengthened after the October 7th brutal attack of Hamas against Israel. It feels that Israel is now in an isolated position. It's no longer Iran. So on the international stage, Iran doesn't feel a crisis of legitimacy. It feels quite emboldened, quite strong. And on the domestic sphere, I think they know that they've lost a battle when it comes to actual legitimacy. They don't care as much. We hear it in rhetorics. They will continue to provide these kind of rhetorics. But in practice, we already see a deviation. So to me, I don't believe that the establishment sees this as a huge crisis of legitimacy that would prove to be a major challenge for them. They actually believe that they can suppress it, they can use repression to control the domestic environment, as long as they have strong standing internationally, have some support in the global south, and are being acknowledged also as kind of an important actor on the global stage.
Thank you so much. And just to add one point on the foreign policy front, actually, as you mentioned today, Ali Bagheri Kani, the chief nuclear negotiator, actually mentioned that the indirect negotiations between Iran and the United States in Oman is still ongoing. So this is also one of the facts that is sometimes ignored, that even during Raisi, the diplomatic channels, albeit in an indirect manner, they were still there. But on other matters, of course, it is important to see how the new president can make any difference. Thank you so much. So back to you, Mahjoub. And there's a couple of questions actually on sort of the juncture of domestic and foreign policy, and it is about basically the role of IRGC. Especially when it comes to regional policy, of course, and the support for Iran-backed militias, the so-called axis of resistance, the role of IRGC matters a lot. Back to the time of Hassan Rouhani, we remember Jawad Zarif's interview in which he said that the role of foreign ministry in Iran's regional policy is almost zero. Again, today, after the election of Pezeshkian, there were some very cordial exchanges of messages between Pezeshkian and Hassan Nasrallah and Bashar al-Assad. So how do you see this balance basically between the president and the IRGC domestically and at the regional level? Because at the domestic level also, what was very, very interesting to me actually today, General Hajizadeh, the commander of our Space Force of IRGC, wrote an op-ed in Jawan newspaper calling Pezeshkian the president of 85 million, not just 16 million, calling for cooperation with him. So this is, I think, very important, and happy to hear your opinion on it.
Thank you, Hamid. Well, I think, as all of you know, the Iranian system, the establishment, is like a bird flies with two wings. One is the supreme leader office, and the other one, or the religious circle, and the other one is the IRG. It's basically the military institution, and that is absolutely obvious. No one can deny it. It's hard to ignore it. However, I think there's also nature of coalition behind the scene between this and that. We saw it in 1997 when reform movement started under Khatami. In 1999, I was myself PhD in Tehran University. Rahim Safawi came in public and said, we cut the zaboon, the tongue of someone who criticizes the supreme leader. That was very, very, very harsh message from someone, the military personnel at that time, against the president, the elected president by 80% of the Iranian people. So that's a coalition. It is there. Sometimes who decides to manage that is the supreme leader and his circle to distance themselves or actually get closer to that because they want to create a balance. And let's remind also you all that since 2005, the supreme leader was no longer distant himself from day-to-day business in Iran. Previous to that, there was sort of feeling the supreme leader is not really in day-to-day business of Iran. In 2005, after Khatami, no, supreme leader is actually there. He was, in a way or other behind Ahmadinejad and after that. So that are changed important in domestic. And how they change the foreign policy, because they change the way how this foreign policy decision has been made. And let's not forget, for example, when it comes to what happened in Syria, for example, there was a huge, I would say, difference between the foreign ministry of Iran and the IRG, because basically they were saying that, what they are doing in Syria against the Iranian foreign policy and using Hamadan military base by Russia was not welcomed by the government, but welcomed by the Sepah, basically. So that tells you that there is a huge I would say there is a differentiation or differences between both sides. But again, when it comes to some points, they have to get together. And one of those points is the election, the presidential election, the parliamentary election, the huge event like, for example, 7th of October. No doubt, Iran, in the last 24 hours, they were shocked of what happened on 7th of October. They were not expected such thing. And the first statement by Amir Abdullahian, he was saying, try just to say, actually, we are observing this. After 24 hours, they tried to say, actually, we have nothing to deal with that. And then Hassan and Nasrallah came and said, actually, we don't know about it. And then they start to say, actually, we are. And then they come back and say, we support the resistance, but we have nothing to deal with this event in particular. Why this happened, do you think? Because they realized the ramification, if they have any kind of affiliation to that event, especially after the Wall Street Journal article when they said there was a meeting in Beirut and Iran was representative were there, and all of this basically complicated the whole thing. So Iranian establishment, especially when it comes to the military institution, they play important role when it comes to the foreign policy in the Arab world in particular. And they are engaged in a lot of files. But this doesn't mean that always this a reflection of the foreign ministry or even the president. There was a difference between the president, the foreign ministry, and them. What happened in Syria, for example, even the way how relation developed with Saudi Arabia, even moving toward East, that itself, as you all know, moving to the East now is costing Iran its all historical industrial sector in Iran, which is nearly destroyed in Iran because of China is actually sending, I would say, all of these products to Iran cheap, and they can compete with the Iranian products, and they kill the industrial of the cars in Iran, the electric cars manufacturing in Iran. So basically, even moving toward East as a conservative slogan is not helping them even to gain politically and economically. So taking all of this into consideration, we have to see that they are struggling with the situation. And the key of all of this is to fix the relation with the West. And how to do it? You have to find a way when it comes to the nuclear issue. So, and now we know that Iran in the last 10 years diversify its own mediation. They went to, first of all, they had the Omani mediator, and now they have Qatar. So they have two mediators with the United States. They try to benefit from both mediators so they can get the message to Washington. And that itself, I think this is a way of Iranian politics that they don't rely on one player. So I think in all of that, Pezeshkian will not bring a new element on that. He has to look at what has been done and how he can capitalize on also some successes, if there are, and also avoid any kind of mistakes, especially when it comes to the relations with China, with Russia, because this relations now is costing them a lot economically, and that cost, it may increase the gap between them and their own base. Let's not forget, most of their base are in the economic sector. And if they lose their own source of revenue, they may basically be upset with the regime itself.
Thank you very much. We have around 7 minutes, so I would like to ask the speakers if we can have kind of final round of concluding remarks, around 2 minutes, and in the same order, actually. Russell, over to you, if there's any points you would like to raise.
Well, we have been talking about the political establishment, the restraints in place, the power dynamics, so many things about the legitimacy crisis that the political establishment is facing, people having serious discontent and disbelief with the governments and so on and so on. As a foreigner who frequently traveled to Iran to cover the developments in Iran, social developments, economic and political developments, just let me share one of my observations with you. So, in my recent deployment to Iran, I have stayed in a hotel, and it's quite a modest hotel, has a cafe restaurant. So, and when you look at the people who are frequently coming and visiting that cafe restaurant through the days and particularly nights, and particularly at the weekends during the nights, so it's a scene that you can typically see in Istanbul, in Dubai, in London, in Paris, or anywhere else. So when you look at that and then you try to judge Iran just based on that scene, that will be quite a misleading scene. So I usually sit on a chair that's directly looking at that cafe when I sit at the lobby. But also right behind me, there's a cage, a glass cage, a fabric from the tomb of Imam Reza from the city of Mashhad has been just taken to the hotel. It's also been exhibited, protected in a glass cage. It's a fabric from the tomb, the shrine, from the shrine of Imam Reza, the eighth Imam, who is buried in Iran. That's also there to bring barakah, fertility to Iran, and to also bring calm and peace, prosperity, and so on. So which one is Iran? That question is that I think sometimes you're too much focusing on the cafe. Sometimes you're too much focusing on that fabric that's been taken from the tomb of Imam Reza. I think Iran is both. During ordinary times, you will see that cafe and you will think that Iran has changed a lot. That is the true identity of Iran. But when the country goes to the extraordinary times, usually Iran becomes that fabric from the tomb of Imam Reza. So I think our focus should be on both sides. So not to jump to quick conclusions that, there's a regime and the end is coming, or the people are really fed up and they want to get rid of everything, whatever they have and so on. I think that's going to be misleading. Iran is both that coffee and that fabric. We need to combine both of them to have a proper picture of the country.
Thank you so much for bringing up this very important point on the nuances of Iranian society, which is always important in analyzing politics as well. Azadeh, over to you.
I think it's important to remember that the Iranian population, or the electorate at least, has tried reformists before. They did come to the ballot boxes in the 90s. They did have high hopes. They tried reformists. They even came back to the ballot boxes on the pragmatic conservatives. They tried it. They tried an alliance with pragmatic conservatives. They tried so-called moderate policies. And they understood generation after generation that in substance, nothing really changed. And I think this is a very important lesson that I also believe, and I, repeat myself, that the establishment is very much aware of it, that the general population, I'm talking about the electorate, which is a strong indicator, even if you go by official numbers, the majority of the electorate doesn't believe in the ballot box as a channel for change, doesn't believe in the office of the president as a channel for change. Even if you go by official numbers, less than 50% took part. And again, even though the fear factor that has been talked about maybe could have been stronger because Jalili was the alternative, even then, only less than 50%, according to official numbers, took to the ballot boxes. I think this is very important. So what we saw since particularly 2019 and the so-called second step of the revolution and these radical kind of ideological strong push by the supreme leader was that you have a population that tried different things. They tried different political channels, didn't work. Now saw that we are entering a transitional phase where spaces were going to shrink even further, now have to face even more repression, more economic misery, on top of ecological crises, on top of a number of other crises that Iran is going through right now, and realize that not only was there no prospect for improvement, but actually that their future would be even bleaker than before. So this is the result that you get in an autocratic system that doesn't provide an outlet, that doesn't provide any kind of prospects through political currents for people to come to the conclusion that the street is the only channel left through which I can push for any form of change. And this is what we've seen not only in the Women Life Freedom protests, they were preceded by a number of nationwide protests since 2017. So we are seeing more and more mass protests in shorter spans of time. And I haven't seen a single current, including the reformists, to bring up any kind of political answer or to make any kind of political offer that would turn around a majority of the electorate to believe that some change could come within. Now, I'm only talking about short-term perspective here because, again, I also agree that I think it's important to not be too deterministic. These things can change. New currents can come up, new dynamics can unfold. People at some point, if they can't move forward with protest, might look for different kind of outlets. All of this is possible. But looking at the current situation that we are in right now, I don't see this happening. I don't see this new president being a signal of hope, having this kind of popular support, and not even having this kind of state support. But what I think is important still, you can criticize, that this is a maybe artificial distinction between reformists and conservatives, between pragmatists and moderates or hardliners. But I actually do believe anyone who studies autocratic systems needs to know about these differences, as minor and minuscule as they may be, because you learn something about dynamics in autocratic systems. You learn something about rifts, you learn something about differences, things that can be exploited, things that can be used for any kind of protest, for any kind of change. So don't regard Iran as this, homogenic bloc where it doesn't even matter who's in charge of what. It does matter, maybe not in terms of fundamental social change, but it does matter in terms of analyzing the power struggles and power sharing architecture of these autocratic systems, and is thus valuable enough for us to actually analyze.
Thank you. Thank you for this emphasis again on the nuances of Iranian politics. And back to you, Dr. Mahjoub.
I think I followed up closely to on Pezeshkian campaign. I think to me, he has no clear discourse about what he wants to do. And that itself could be helpful for him, because basically that could help him in doing what I call it day-to-day politics, which basically trying to look at what's happening, try to be reactionary rather than coming with a clear action. I think considering the regional uncertainty, global uncertainty when it comes to economy, politics, I think Iran, like other countries in the region, they are suffering from this uncertainty. Iran is not exceptional of that. Iran will be suffering because of its, role and play in some areas. But I think this president in particular, I don't think that he will be able to come with a very clear discourse and slogan, say, this is me. I think he, with his government, he will be running Iran based on day-to-day politics and being more reactionary rather than, because everything when it comes to foreign policy, domestic politics in the last 44 years has been tested, examined in Iran. And everything he wants to bring back is repeating it. So I think he will try to look at things based on a day-to-day politics that could help him maybe to survive and also to avoid any confrontation within domestic politics and also when it comes to foreign policy.
Thank you so much. My thanks to the three speakers. It was a very rich discussion. I learned a lot from all of you, and
Excellent.
I hope we stay in touch. Also, many thanks to the audience and for the questions. Apologies if we couldn't address all of them. As you can see, there's a lot to unpack here, but hopefully there will be other opportunities in the future. Thank you to the Middle East Council for organizing this, and until